beginning with the closing argument of the state. Go ahead, Ms. Hughes.
Chloe Chandler was a 5-year-old girl who skipped down the hallways at school. But because of what happened on July 19th, 2018, she will never graduate from kindergarten. She'll never go on to high school, graduate from high school. She'll never be able to go on to college. She won't get her first job. She won't have her first boyfriend or get married. She also won't be able to see her little brother Phoenix grow up or do any of his first-time things. She was a beautiful girl who had so much life to live. But that life was brutally taken from her when she was strangled to death by her mother. We all know what a mother's supposed to do. Protect you, love you, watch over you, care for you. All things that I'm sure the defendant was trying to do. But it all became too much for her because on July 19th, 2018, the defendant decided she was finally going to get that break that she thinks she deserved and needed. We would have loved for you to meet Chloe, but you couldn't. The defendant made sure that July 19th, 2018 was the last day Chloe was on this earth. That was the day that the defendant turned this beautiful, vibrant, lovely little girl from this to this. You now know how this day started. The defendant didn't want to deal with Chloe that day. She left Chloe home with Aaron while Aaron was sleeping. Aaron didn't know she was there, and Kelsie, the defendant, went to run errands with her dad and her son, Phoenix. The defendant came home with her son, Phoenix, and she saw that Chloe was watching TV. She asked Chloe what she was doing and why she was watching TV and why she wasn't in her room alone. At some point, Chloe had told the defendant she was hungry. The defendant made some ravioli for Phoenix and Chloe. Aaron got up from sleeping. He got ready to go to his friend's house so that he could do some work on a friend's car. The defendant had to take care of her kids again that day on her own, and she wasn't happy about it. She wanted to put the kids down for a nap because she wanted to sleep. She was tired and she needed 2 hours of sleep before she went to work. The defendant told Chloe, "You're going to take a nap or I'm going to beat your ass," because she wanted to make sure she could rest. Chloe, like any other normal 5-year-old, didn't want to take a nap. So she ran away from that bed. And what did her mother do? She took those pajama pants, she threw them over her, pulled back, and strangled her with those pajama pants. She didn't want to deal with Chloe's attitude anymore. She had had enough. She was sick of dealing with her bad behavior, so she used those pajama pants as her mechanism to kill Chloe. In Chloe's last moments on this earth, she would fight for her life, staring at her own mother. She took her last breaths in her own bedroom, where her mother made sure she wasn't here today to tell her story about what she did that day. Afterwards, the defendant didn't know what to do. It was too late for Chloe, but she had to do something to save herself. She had to come up with a story. She had hours to think about this. She had to come up with a story that would explain the marks on Chloe's neck. Since she was the only one home besides her 2-year-old son, Phoenix, she had to make it look like an accident. She called 911 and said that she found her daughter hanging in the closet. She was hoping everyone would believe her, that they just wouldn't ask any questions. At that point, Chloe was already dead. Corey Binge told you he was the first responder and that when he went there, he felt her extremities and that they were already cold. He told you that he normally wouldn't have even done CPR or performed life-saving measures on somebody, but he did it desperately hoping that he could save Chloe's life or bring her back to life. But he told you she never had a pulse from when he went and started those life-saving measures. Later that night, you heard about how the defendant talked to Sergeant Leffler, briefly on scene, and then later at the hospital. And that was the audio. It was actually a video, but you couldn't really see anything on the video. But you could hear Sergeant Leffler asking the defendant questions about what happened. And that's when she said that she found Chloe hanging from the closet, hanging from the pajama pants, that came undone when she pulled her out. These pajama pants that she wants you to believe held the weight of her daughter to the point that it caused her to go unconscious and then killed her. They just came off the rod, just like that. Later that night, a few hours later, you heard from Kelly, the defendant's mom. She told you she heard that something had happened to Chloe. The defendant didn't call her to tell her what happened. So she called her and said, "What are you doing?" And the defendant's response, several hours after she supposedly found her daughter dead, was eating. Then her mom asked her, "How's Chloe?" And what was her response then? "How did you find out?" I don't care how close you are to your family or to your mother. That is an absolutely ridiculous response when you just found your daughter dead. That's what they want you to believe. The next day, the police wanted to go through with what happened. Investigator Sieren went over to the house and met with Aaron and Kelsie to talk and walk through what exactly happened that day. And you were able to see that video, and you'll be able to take, like the judge told you, the exhibits back, the evidence to view if you choose. Look through those videos. Look through all the different audios that we put into evidence. Specifically in that interview, determine for yourself if you believe that the defendant is telling the truth. When she talks about how she went to the closet and she found Chloe hanging, facing this area, and she specifically talks about that chair, that she's not above that chair, that the chair is to the side, and that the chair was in the same position it's always in. She also talks about the pants again. And during that interview, she says that when she took Chloe out of the pants, that her head came right out. And she indicated that the pants stayed on the rod. Look at the defendant's demeanor during that interview. Of course, people act differently in different situations. Trauma affects everybody differently. But ask yourself what you think about Kelsie's demeanor during that interview. How she's talking to the police about this horrible, tragic event that just happened, about 23 hours after she supposedly found her daughter hanging in this closet. The defendant's cousin, Brittany Johnson, wanted to help, so she told you. She went to the police station and then decided that day, this is the day after Chloe's death, to go over to the defendant's house and to talk to them. And Brittany Johnson told you about the demeanor that she witnessed that day, that it just didn't seem right, that she was with the defendant and Aaron for a few hours, and they were talking about what had happened. And Brittany Johnson told you that during that conversation, the defendant said that she had witnessed her own daughter die. She also told you that she was talking about Chloe specifically and talking about her bad attitude, how it was hard to look at her sometimes because she looked so much like her father that cheated on the defendant when she was pregnant with her. She also told you that the defendant was mad that the police were investigating this. Again, very peculiar behavior. A few days later was Chloe's autopsy. Dr. Chandler told you that Chloe's injuries were not consistent with a hanging. There was a lot of injury, and there was a struggle. Because force equals injury, and Chloe had a lot of injury. This wasn't a hanging. This was a strangulation, a manual strangulation, where Chloe fought for her life. The officers continued the investigation, and they asked both Kelsie and Aaron to come down to the police station to speak with them. And the defendant went to the police station on her own and talked to them. And that was that first interview where you saw, I think it was about 30 clips of a 6-hour interview. And during that interview, the defendant initially says that she left Chloe at home that day because she was sleeping when she left. This was prior to the events that happened. Then she comes back and says, well, I didn't leave her at home because she was sleeping. I just left her at home because I didn't want to deal with her. So I left her at home while Aaron was sleeping. Why didn't she tell the truth about that at first? She also talked about the pants again in that interview. She talked about how the pants came off of Chloe, but then she wasn't sure if they came off of the rod or off of Chloe because she didn't know what actually happened to those pants. Every time they were asking her, there was something different. She talked a lot in that interview also about Chloe's behavior and how Chloe had started acting out. She didn't listen. She would do whatever she wanted regardless of what you told her to do. That she was acting out for attention, just giving you a little bit of a clue of what was going on in the defendant's mind. She initially said, no, I never asked any family members for help. Then she comes back and says, well, yeah, I asked my dad a week or two ago. And she also says, well, maybe I asked my mom to take her for a weekend. It's also during that interview when the police ask her, because she's talking about how Aaron never turned out to be the father she thought he would be, have you ever had a break? And her response was, now. Kelsie left on her own that day and agreed to come back to do a second interview because the police wanted to talk to her further and to talk to her more about what had happened. And you saw most of that entire interview. It was pretty lengthy. And obviously, if you need to watch it again, go for it and watch it and watch the defendant's demeanor, watch her behavior, watch and listen to the things that she says. She initially starts saying, well, I pushed on her chest and told her she just needed to stay. It's nap time. You need to go to sleep or I will beat your ass. And she walked out. Then she starts talking a little bit more, says, well, when I pushed on her chest, she looked awake when I left. I thought she was awake, so I went to sleep. She told the investigators in that interview she just wanted to sleep. She was so freaking tired. She just wanted to take a nap. She wanted 2 hours. She talked about how hard it was taking care of 2 kids. When she works as much as she does, she has a husband that doesn't give a fuck, to be honest with you. That's what she said to the investigators. She started giving lots of different versions of what actually happened that day. And of course the officers keep asking questions. Are they supposed to just say okay and walk out of the room? No, they're still talking to Kelsie about what happened. They're asking her about the evidence. She then starts talking more about what happened. She initially confesses, but she's still minimizing, still not saying exactly what happened. And then she does. She talks about how she put one foot in front of the other, and that she then took those pajama pants and threw them over Chloe's head. She even makes the movement and does it, showing the investigator several times that that's what she did with those pajama pants. She talks about how Chloe started shaking and moving when she did that, how she got wobbly and started to go down. She then talks about how she picked her up and put her on the bed. She even said at that point she was still so angry. It had came to her mind at that point she might be gone, but she hoped that she wasn't. So she had decided she was going to go and take a nap and hope that when she came back, she was alive. She said in that interview, her heart was racing, and she was still so angry when she left that room. She talked about how then she went and laid in bed for approximately 2 hours and maybe closed her eyes for some of that time. Now, those are the facts, and that's the evidence that we presented to you. When you go back into the jury room to complete your deliberations, there are 3 tools that you take with you. The first is the evidence and the facts. That's everything that came from this witness stand, as well as the evidence and the exhibits that have been admitted into evidence. The facts that came to you through those witnesses. The second tool is the law, and Judge Gammon just read the law to you and gave you copies of it as well. And you have to apply the law to the facts and the evidence presented in the case. The third tool, and probably the most important tool, is your common sense. Your collective common sense that comes from your everyday life experiences. You are definitely allowed to use that. Don't check that at the door when you go in there to deliberate. Use your common sense to evaluate the facts and the evidence and apply the law. And I'm confident that the only verdict that you will come up with is a verdict of guilty. As the judge just read to you in one of the instructions, you have a duty in this case. When we started this trial 6 days ago, you all took an oath to follow that oath, and you have a duty, like I said, that the judge just read to you. You have a duty. Your sole duty is to find the truth and do justice. One of the other instructions that the judge just read to you, and something that we talked about a little bit in jury selection, is direct and circumstantial evidence. That instruction indicates, in considering all the evidence, make deductions and reach conclusions according to common sense. Facts may be proved by direct evidence, circumstantial evidence, or both. Circumstantial evidence is evidence about a chain of facts which show a defendant is guilty or not guilty. The law makes no distinction between direct evidence and circumstantial evidence. We only have to prove the elements of the crime charged. We also talked about this in jury selection. It is the state's burden of proof to prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant committed murder and child endangerment resulting in death. So let's go over each of those counts. First, when we're talking about murder in the first degree, the state must prove all of the following elements of murder in the first degree. First, on or about the 19th day of July, 2018, the defendant strangled Chloe Chandler. How do we know that the defendant strangled Chloe? There's absolutely no one else home. There's no signs of anyone else in the house. In several of Kelsie's interviews, she talks about how she didn't hear anything, she didn't see anything. There's no evidence of struggle. We know the only people in that house are the defendant, Chloe, and her two-year-old son. When you look at the scene photos and the evidence or the testimony that came to you from the officers and the first responding officers, you heard that there's no vomit in that closet because Chloe was never in that closet. That was the defendant's story when she was trying to come up with something. The pants and the vomit are both on the bed. That's consistent with what the defendant tells you. It corroborates her story. Those pants aren't in the closet. Even if you believe her first, second, third version about what happened to those pants, why would she pick up those pants and put them on the bed? This is somebody, if you believe her story, that walks into this room and sees her daughter hanging there. Even if you believe the pants fell off, why would you then pick up the pants and bring them on the bed? Because that never happened. The pants were on the bed because she dropped them after she strangled her, just like she told you through her confession. This hanging was not possible based on the photos you saw, based on everything that you heard. First, you would have to believe that Chloe tied this double knot. Yes, she can tie her shoes. But to think that this child, a 5-year-old, could tie a double knot to the point that her head would fall into it. And you would have to believe essentially that she jumped into it. Because Chloe, if you believe Kelsey's first story and believe all of this, she even talks about how the chair is off to the side. So you would have to believe that she just jumped and happened to fall into this opening. And even if you believe that, what about, I just showed you that photo. There's no evidence of struggle in that closet. There's nothing, no damage to that closet rod, nothing to there's those 3 bars where Kelsie wants you to believe she's facing in that other part of the closet. If you really believe that Chloe had accidentally hung herself, she could have taken her feet and swung them on that. You would have seen evidence of something. If you really believe that this happened in the closet, there would have been vomit in the closet. There was no vomit in the closet because Chloe wasn't in the closet. It was on the bed after the defendant took her and put her on the bed, just like she told you. We also know that the defendant strangled Chloe by her actions, both before and after Chloe's death. You heard from her mom and her cousin about how ever since Phoenix was born, that Chloe was just a nuisance to the defendant. Chloe reminded her of her father that cheated on her. She talked about Chloe's bad behavior. She asked her mother to take Chloe. And she didn't tell her daughter after about the death. You can consider all of this. We also know, based on the defendant's demeanor in the interviews, look at her demeanor in all of them. Rewatch them if you need to. I know you guys were all paying attention. And then we've also had the defendant's confession. She talked about what happened that day. She knew facts that nobody else knew because it was only her and Chloe in that room that day. Not only do you have that, you have the letter that she wrote to her family afterwards. You saw on the video, she sat there for, 7-10 minutes writing that letter. Nobody was forcing her to do that. Then you also have the phone calls. Later that night, she calls her husband and says she's sorry. I didn't mean to hurt her. And then 24 hours later, on the next day, she says the same thing to her husband again. Nobody's forcing her to say anything. We also have the medical evidence. Dr. Chandler told you hangings cause little or no injury. Strangulations have more injuries because of struggle and force. And that makes sense. I know Dr. Chandler's testimony was very long and she gave you lots of different examples. She told you that in hangings, when somebody starts hanging themselves, the noose goes up and you generally see injuries higher in the neck. And what happens is the person loses consciousness within 3 to 15 seconds. She told you how that's different than a strangulation. When there's a struggle, when there's friction, when there's force, and that's what she observed here, both on the injuries on the outside of Chloe's neck and the inside of her neck. She told you that there was evidence of blunt force injury to her neck, and there was injuries to both sides of her neck. That there was a deep hemorrhage to the back of her neck, an injury to the carotid artery. She told you that the cause of death was strangulation. Look at the photos. Obviously, those are also part of evidence. When you look at all of the injuries that Chloe had, this wasn't somebody that just accidentally hung themselves. This was somebody who was fighting for their lives, struggling to survive. Now, Dr. Chandler also talked to you about this area specifically, about how she believes that this is an outline of Chloe's hand. It might not be that easy to see, but in the photos, it's a little bit easier to see. She told you how at the bottom of that, it looks like there's scratches. Don't take Dr. Kettler's word for it. Examine those photos yourself. You are the finders of fact. And when you look at that, it's just another piece of evidence that shows how Chloe was struggling to survive. We have proven the first element, that on that date, the defendant strangled Chloe Chandler. The second element is that Chloe Chandler was under the age of 14. That is not disputed. Chloe was 5 years old when she died, so we've proven that element. The third element is that Chloe Chandler died as a result of being strangled by the defendant. Oh. Does it go here, do you know? The third element, Chloe Chandler died as a result of being strangled by the defendant. And there's a further instruction that says the strangulation by the defendant resulted in death of Chloe Chandler if it caused or directly contributed to Chloe Chandler's death. We know that the way that Chloe died that day was from the injuries that she had. And we know that it came from her mother, the defendant, based on what we've already talked about. We know that on that day, Chloe Chandler died as a result of being strangled by the defendant. We've proven that element. Fourth, the defendant acted with malice aforethought. Malice aforethought is a state of mind which leads one to intentionally do a wrongful act to the injury of another in disregard of the rights of another out of actual hatred or with an evil or unlawful purpose. It may be established by evidence of actual hatred or by proof of a deliberate or fixed intent to do injury. Fixed purpose or design to do some physical harm to another which exists before the act is committed. It does not have to exist for any particular length of time. We know that the defendant intended to do this act. She intended to cause injury to Chloe Chandler. There is no other intent when you take pajama pants and use them in the way that she did. She clearly disregarded Chloe's rights out of both actual hatred and with an evil and unlawful purpose. Again, there's no purpose other than an unlawful one when you do that. She was acting at that moment out of hatred and evil as well, and we know that based on what she told you. She was so angry while this was happening and after. We also know what the defendant did was systematic and deliberate. She picked up those pants and she used them. She talked about when she continued to carry out the act that Chloe's body was reacting. It was wobbling, it was shaking. It wasn't in the heat of the moment where she just got angry and then all of a sudden stopped and was like, oh my goodness, what did I do? We know, based on the injuries, that there was struggle. Chloe fought for her life. As Dr. Chandler told you, injury equals force involved. When you think about Chloe's injuries, both on the outside of her neck and all of the internal injuries, we know that the defendant acted with malice aforethought. We have proven that fourth element. Fifth, the defendant was committing the offense of assault against Chloe Chandler. And there's also a definition of assault. And what the state needs to prove for that element is that the defendant did an act which was specifically intended to cause pain or injury to Chloe Chandler. And that seems a little bit redundant. We've already talked about that. But the defendant's act specifically intended to cause pain to Chloe. It intended to cause injury. It caused her death. And we know that the defendant had the apparent ability to do the act. She did the act. We have proven that fifth element. Sixth, that Chloe Chandler's death occurred under circumstances showing an extreme indifference to human life. The defendant's actions showed indifference to Chloe's life. She picked up those pajama pants and she used them. She continued to use them on her until she took her life. She strangled her with those pajama pants. Like we've talked about, those injuries were 4 levels deep. Dr. Chandler told you about how she peeled away the skin and then the muscles and all of the different injuries that she observed. Another way that we know that there was indifference to human life, the defendant waited hours to call the police. She had decided that she was going to go take a nap and hope that she was awake, didn't do anything to save her life, didn't call 911. She didn't want to deal with her. We have proven that sixth element, that Chloe Chandler's death occurred under circumstances showing an extreme indifference to human life. We have proven murder in the first degree. The second count is child endangerment resulting in death. The state must prove all of the following elements of child endangerment resulting in death. First, on or about the 19th day of July 2018, the defendant was the parent or a person having custody or control of Chloe Chandler. Again, this is not disputed. We all know that the defendant was Chloe's mother. We also know she was home alone with Chloe that day and her son Phoenix. We know that from Aaron, we know that from the defendant's statements, and we know that from the first responders. So we have proven that first element. The second is that Chloe Chandler was under the age of 14 years. We also know that she was 5 at the time that this happened, so we have proven that second element. The third, the defendant intentionally committed an act or series of acts which used unreasonable force, torture, or cruelty that resulted in physical injury to Chloe Chandler. We know based on what the defendant did that day that those acts were unreasonable because they caused Chloe's death. We know that they were unreasonable because no mother, no person should ever take their hands and use them either by themselves or with some type of device to strangle somebody. We know that that's torture. We know that what she did caused physical injury to Chloe. So we have proven that proposition. And the last element is that the defendant's acts resulted in the death of Chloe Chandler. And again, we know based on everything we've talked about and the evidence and the witnesses that what happened that day caused Chloe Chandler's death. So we have proven that last element. We have proven the defendant guilty of both murder in the first degree and child endangerment resulting in death. The evidence in this case is overwhelming, and the trail of evidence leads to only one place, to where Chloe's murderer sits across this courtroom from you today. And make no mistake, the defendant earned that seat in this courtroom by what she did that day, by her actions, her choices. Today is the day that you make her take responsibility for that. On July 19th, 2018, the defendant turned Chloe's bedroom, a place that a child should cherish and feel safe, into her murder scene. She made sure that Chloe wasn't here to tell you what happened that day. But over the last 6 days, Chloe's voice has finally been heard again. It's been heard in this courtroom every day through the witnesses and the evidence and the exhibits. Chloe's telling you, she showed you through all of the witnesses and the testimony that the defendant is the one that did this to her. She's the one that committed this vicious and senseless murder. Chloe must have been terrified that day as she fought for her life, pleading with her mother to stop. The nightmare started that day for this innocent 5-year-old who was sweet and who had her whole life ahead of her. But it's been going on since that day. This nightmare started that day for her family, her friends, for everybody that's had to deal with the loss of this little girl. But today, this nightmare finally ends. It finally ends because today is the day that Chloe gets the justice she deserves. Today is the day you find the defendant guilty of both murder in the first degree and child endangerment resulting in death.
Members of the jury, you have heard the state's final argument. We are now going to take an early lunch break. When we come back, we will have the defendant's final argument. During that time, of course, remember all the prior admonitions, keep an open mind, talk to anyone about this case, pay no attention to any media accounts, do no investigation. Please be back in the jury room by noon We will see you then.